Well, this is, of course, a Chesterton Academy, so when I want to know what does G.K. Chesterton say about this or that topic, I pick up my phone and I call a familiar number, and after one ring it goes to voicemail. And so I am expecting this, of course, and so then I wait a minute, I call it again, and this time it doesn't even finish the first ring, it just goes immediately to voicemail. And then I wait another minute, and then I call it again, and then I hear the tried and short and impatient voice of Mr. John Howting say, "What do you want, Joe?" I'm in the middle of G.K. Chesterton's orthodoxy, and you're interrupting me. I've lost track of how many of our conversations have begun that way. John Howting is on the editorial staff of Chronicles magazine, which is a magazine of American culture. He also oversees circulation and customer service for the Charlemagne Institute, which is the publisher of Chronicles magazine, a conservative publication. He has several published works on G.K. Chesterton that can be found in the, for example, official publication of the American Chesterton Society, Gilbert magazine, as well as First Things, Front Porch Republic, and Alatea. He has also, in addition to being published on G.K. Chesterton specifically, been published in a number of publications on just politics and conservative thought in general, in organizations such as the American Conservative, American Greatness, Intellectual Takeout, and the National Pulse, just to name a few. As someone who has proofread much of Mr. Howting's work before it's been submitted, I can tell you that a lot of his best work has yet to be published, not because it hasn't been submitted, but because no one wants to publish it. You see the political publications find his work to be too academic, and the academic publications find his work to be too political. So, if that doesn't tell you everything about the state of modern society. In addition, speaking of politics, Mr. Howting is also the former deputy research director of the Michigan Republican Party, and he is a veteran of political campaigns. In his free time, he runs Men Among the Ruins, which is a Catholic layman's group in southeast Michigan that has a special devotion to G.K. Chesterton. And what's more, he's a good man, and he's my friend. And so without further ado, I yield the podium.
My father used to say, whenever you speak at something, just whatever you do, make sure you sit as close to the podium as possible. And I said, well, don't you want to take in all that applause as you walk up there? I said, let me tell you something. There's no longer walk in the world than that last 8 feet when the applause runs out. So sit close. Headmaster said that he would give me a signal at the 3-hour mark. I hope that everybody is comfortable and has something to drink. I adore everything that you do here at this school. As I watch the students and teachers pursue knowledge for its own sake, or useless knowledge as I like to call it, I'm reminded of that special relationship that Chesterton saw between useless things and freedom. I believe that your institution has a special role to play in the restoration of freedom in this country. And I sincerely hope that by the end of my talk, you'll understand why it is that I say that. Mr. G.K. Chesterton, your model, my good friend, once said, the opposite of employment is not unemployment, but independence. Employment, or what we more commonly refer to as work, is activity done for some utilitarian end. So when he says the opposite of employment is independence, he is saying that true independence, or freedom, involves doing things for their own sake. And here we need to make an important distinction. Things done for their own sake he called useless. Doing things for their own sake he called freedom. A waged slave, writes Chesterton, is a slave. Now, this does not mean that everybody who has a job and works for a living is a slave. That's not what we're saying here, or that work is somehow bad. But work is something that we do so we can have time and place away from work. Okay? Aristotle says this near the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. Men work so that they can have leisure. It's a fine way of putting it, but Chesterton would put it this way. We partake in useful activities so that we can have time and space to partake in useless activity. Chesterton warned that as we did away with useless things and useless activities, we would lose our freedom. Sanity, which is where I would like to start, is one of those things that is necessary for freedom, and I doubt anyone would argue with that. A man cannot be free if he is not sane, if he doesn't have a certain amount of mental health. An insane man or a madman is not free. He is enslaved by his own delusions. But another distinction between the sane, healthy man and the madman is that the sane, healthy man does useless things. He partakes in useless activities, where the insane or madman is obsessed with being useful all the time. Now, Chesterton got into a debate with R.B. Suthers on this matter in 1906 in the Clarion newspaper. He recounts it early on in his book, Orthodoxy. Suthers claimed that free will was lunacy because it meant useless action, and the actions of a lunatic would be useless. Chesterton countered by saying that the last thing that can be said of a lunatic is that his actions are useless. If any human actions may be called useless, writes Chesterton, they are the minor acts of a healthy man, whistling as he walks, slashing the grass with a stick, kicking his heels or rubbing his hands. It is the happy, healthy, sane man who does the useless things. Chesterton writes, if the madman could for an instant become careless, he would become sane. The madman reads far too much reasonableness and usefulness into all human activity. And flag waving is a great example of this, right? Men have never needed a hugely significant reason to wave their nation's flag, okay? It's something that we've always done, and we do it all the time. But the maniac, the maniac looks at men waving flags, and he thinks, well, these men are insurrectionists. That's how the maniac thinks. If you have ever had a coworker who thought that everyone in the office was conspiring against him, then you have dealt with a maniac. That's a fine example of a maniac. He hyper-focuses on instances where the HR lady was mean to him. But he never considers the fact that the HR lady is mean to everybody. Just making people's life miserable. It's kind of just her shtick. It's something that she does out of habit. But you see, the maniac cannot accept this. As Chesterton puts it, the maniac is trapped in that clean, well-lit prison of a single idea. The idea that all patriotic men are subversive, or the idea that the entire office is conspiring against him. He's trapped in that clean, well-lit prison of a single idea. Boy, doesn't that remind anybody of a poem? We just celebrated the 450th anniversary of what victory in October? Lepanto, yes. And many a one grows witless in his quiet room in hell as a yellow face looks inward through the lattice of his cell, right? Going witless, descending into insanity. If the maniac would simply put aside his precious single idea and take a leisurely walk, he'd realize that most of the people in the office really don't care about him. And patriotic men are not monsters. It's absurd. If the maniac could simply be careless and partake in some useless activity, he would be rid of his mania. When we take time away from our usual toil and engage in useless activity, when we gaze at something simply to see what there is to see, like a child gazes at something, we begin to fear that there is some further layer of complexity that we do not yet understand. We begin to wonder. The sane man begins his thinking by wondering. First, he gazes upon things, then he wonders about them, and then he comes to his conclusion. But the maniac, he thinks backwards. The maniac starts at his conclusion, and then he looks for things that confirm his conclusion, his one isolated single idea. The thinking of a maniac is confined. He thinks in a circle, as Chesterton says. The maniac thinks in a circle. But the thinking of a sane, healthy man is not confined. His thinking progresses down a road. He observes things, he wonders about them, he reasons his way to some truth, he wonders about that truth, and then he figures out more truth. He progresses from what is more familiar to what is less familiar, from what is more known to what is less known. Aristotle called this the order of learning. Chesterton called this free thinking. Why does Chesterton begin his great work, Orthodoxy, with this chapter about mania, this chapter about the insane versus sane? After a brief introduction, we get this chapter titled The Maniac, where Chesterton tells us about some insane asylum called Hanwell. And he spends a great deal of time telling us how to avoid Hanwell. But why doesn't he tell us how to avoid hell? I mean, a mental hospital doesn't sound pleasant, but come on. Hell has got to be worse than any nut house, right? Chesterton explains that modern men do not believe in hell, but they do believe in Hanwell. He knows that Hanwell is more familiar to his readers. Men usually encounter insanity before they encounter damnation. They see Hanwell before they see hell. Chesterton is proceeding from what is more known to what is less known. He is proceeding down Aristotle's road, the order of learning. He is inviting his reader to proceed down that road. He is inviting his reader to partake in free thinking. You see, one of the things that makes Chesterton so great is that he is a free thinker. Now, free thought, we need to make another distinction here. Free thought is not keeping an open mind, okay? Free thinking is not open-mindedness. I opened my intellect as I opened my mouth so I could shut it on something solid, writes Chesterton. Okay? We open the mind for the same reason we open our mouths, to shut it on something. And if you cannot shut your mind on solid truth, then you cannot think. The whole point of free thought is to satisfy our natural desire to know. Now, there are two big groups of professional thinkers or wise guys, or so-called philosophers, and pay attention because you need to watch out for these guys. These guys are out to destroy free thought, and there's two types. One, those who say thinking is not valid, and two, those who say that there is nothing to think about. The former insists that the intellect cannot be trusted. The latter insists that there is nothing that the intellect can trust. Both of these professional wise guys, though, both camps agree that the common man cannot think for himself. Don't even try it. There's no point. Let us, the professionals, the experts, think for you. Chesterton called this the suicide of thought. He writes, just as one generation could prevent the very existence of the next generation by all entering a monastery or jumping into the sea, so one set of thinkers can in some degree prevent further thinking by teaching the next generation that there is no validity in any human thought. The suicide of thought precipitates an entrenchment and growth of the current powers within government and business. If the common man doesn't trust his own thinking, he will not consider how to drastically improve things, and he will not foment revolution even in the face of tyrants. It is for this reason, according to Chesterton, that tyrants like to propagate modern, philosophical, skeptical literature. It keeps the common man from engaging in the useless act of thinking, which often precedes the useful act of revolution. Chesterton tells the story of Mr. Gradgrind, the factory owner who distributes modern books that sow doubt and relativism in the minds of his employees. The worker in Mr. Gradgrind's factory, the little clerk in Mr. Gradgrind's office, he is too mentally worried to believe in freedom. He is kept quiet with revolutionary literature. He is calmed and kept in his place by a constant succession of wild philosophies. He is a Marxian one day, a Nietzscheite the next day, a Superman probably the next day, and a slave every day. The only thing that remains after all the philosophies is the factory. The only man who gains by all the philosophies is Gradgrind. It would be worth his while to keep his commercial helotry supplied with skeptical literature. And now, as I come to think of it, of course, Gradgrind is famous. Gradgrind is famous for giving libraries. He shows his sense. All modern books are on his side. So when the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation decide they want to give Volo a library, you know what to say, or you can do whatever you want. You leave it at that. All modern philosophy is a war on the common man and his free thinking. Once a man is drunk on this literature, he will be skeptical of everything, even his own thinking. He will not gather with friends down at the public house to discuss what must be done with those in power. And that's what politics used to look like. Common men getting together, going down to the public house to discuss what must be done with those in power. Now politics consists of those in power running off to Washington, D.C. to discuss what is to be done with us. But what were the public houses of which Chesterton so often writes in his articles and essays? They were local watering holes, places where men would gather, drink, share thoughts with one another. They would engage in free thought together. They would wonder about things together. And they would gain common sense. But what is common sense? We use this word a lot, don't we? Common sense consists of experiences and events that can be sensed by the common ruck of men. Common sense is yet another useless thing that is necessary for freedom. Common sense, you can have all the common sense in the world, but that's not going to buy you a cup of coffee down the street at Dunkin' Donuts. But common sense is necessary for you to govern yourself. It's necessary for your freedom. Some things are a matter of common sense. Now, I'm not saying all things, okay? Some things. All right, here's an example. Is it snowing outside? Okay, our ancestors would have answered that question by using their common sense. What's amazing is if you ask a young person today, is it snowing outside? He'll take his cell phone out of his pocket and he'll look at his weather app. That's nuts. We can tell, I mean, what the heck? Is it snowing outside? We can answer that question without any machines or even a meteorologist, okay? Likewise, the question of abortion. The common man does not need some expert in a lab coat to tell him that murdering your own child in the womb is bad. It is a matter of common sense. Then there's this whole debate over trans surgery or transgender surgery or whatever it's called, which is kind of dumb. It really shouldn't be a debate. The Progressive presents his study showing that people who get trans surgery live happy lives after they get it. Oh, but the Conservative presents his own study showing that they do not live happy lives after they get it. But should this debate really be adjudicated by competing studies, dueling studies? I mean, I think that's kind of weird. Look, our common lived experience would inform us that mutilating one's own genitalia is just not a path to human happiness. And we don't need a man in a lab coat to tell us this. That's just stupid. Nor do we need a man in a lab coat to tell us that men and women exist and that they are distinct from one another. Okay? And and it's apparent that they are created to be this way. And it's apparent to any normal person. When a community is governed by common men with common sense, little boys are taught to be men and little girls are taught to be women. We lose common sense when we accept the modern notion that machines or studies or men in lab coats are the only means by which truth can be attained. We gain common sense, according to Chesterton, by partaking in this thing called culture. But what is culture? Culture is the process whereby free and independent men are melded into a free and independent community. That's what it means to cultivate. When a man cultivates a garden, he brings together these disparate parts, these disparate things, the soil, the fertilizer, and the seed, and he brings them together and he makes them into a distinct community towards a common end. A self-governing community of free men has its own culture. If the men in the community do not share a common culture, then they're not a community. And if they're adopting or buying into the culture of some other group, then they're no longer self-governing because they're having the terms dictated to them by somebody else. Therefore, no longer self-governing. Culture is a collection of useless things and useless activities created by the common ruck of men and handed down to subsequent generations. It is made by common men within a community, therefore it is democratic, but it is passed down to subsequent generations, and therefore it is also traditional. So culture is both democratic and traditional. It is for this reason that Chesterton refers to culture as the democracy of the dead in orthodoxy. I hope this doesn't cause confusion, that phrase democracy of the dead, because I know how seriously you people in the Chicago area take that whole dead people voting stuff. Let's go, Brandon. The primary, all right, let's settle down. The primary example of culture in orthodoxy is the fairy tale. Fairy tales are crafted by the common ruck of men, not by experts. As Chesterton writes, the fairy tale is written by the majority of the men in the village who are sane. The history book is written by the one man in the village who is insane. And of course, fairy tales are passed down to our posterity. But the same could be said of festivals, holidays, dances, songs, and perhaps even liturgy, which after all means community action. Liturgy is also passed down through generations. Notice all of these things, fairy tales, holidays, dances, liturgy, these are all useless things. We partake in them for their own sake. We don't partake in them for any utilitarian end. These useless things are necessary for freedom to survive within a community. As they go, so goes freedom. Indeed, our loss of freedom has a great deal to do with our loss of culture. When we stop dancing and singing for ourselves, when we hire professionals to dance and sing for us, when we stop telling our own stories, what do? We hire professionals. You stop singing, you hire professionals to sing for you. We stop telling our own stories, conveying our own morals. We hire professionals in Hollywood to tell us stories conveying their morals. The prominent place once occupied by the fairy tale is now occupied by the superhero movie. Superhero movies, which are not fairy tales. These superhero films are not written by or passed down from our ancestors. They're Hollywood creations. They have nothing to do with the common man or his patrimony. They are not crafted by common men in the public house, nor are they bequeathed to us by our parents. They are not culture. Hollywood films, according to Chesterton, are indicative of cultural decline and a loss of freedom. Modern men cannot enjoy themselves. That is to say, modern men cannot amuse themselves, and therefore they must be amused. He continues, they do not enjoy themselves, just as they do not govern themselves. They have to enjoy something that does not come from themselves, but from a class of men richer or more cunning or more scientific than themselves. Now listen to the second part of this quote and think of action movies, if you can. Men will not be truly free so long as they depend, even on the most magic machine, for the emotion of seeing other people falling off precipices or rescuing brides from burning houses. Freedom will mean a citizen's interest in his own wife, in his own hearth, and in his own house on fire, and a free man will fall off of his own private precipice. That's from Objections to the Cinema, June 19th, 1920, Illustrated London News, in case anyone is interested. Chesterton compared modern cinema to the bread and circuses of the late Roman Republic. It's cheap entertainment given to the common man from those in power to keep him distracted and docile. We should not rely on professionals for our storytelling, said Chesterton, nor should we rely on them for our fighting. He was weary of professional soldiers. He considered them yet another sign of freedom slipping away from the common man. He cautioned that power was transferring from the common man to the professional soldier due to a loss of courage within the community. Chesterton writes, the professional soldier gains more and more power as the general courage of the community declines. When we lose courage, when men lose their courage, they hire professionals to fight for them. The honor paid, but here's the big question, right? We all agree that courage is necessary for the preservation of freedom. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But how do you create courage? Or how do we foster courage among men within a community? The honor paid to useless things plays a special role in fostering courage within a community by asking men to be fools. As Chesterton writes, a man who has faith must be prepared not only to be a martyr, but to be a fool. It is absurd to say that a man is ready to toil and die for his convictions when he is not even ready to wear a wreath around his head for them. Christmas and the Aesthetes, Heretics. The useless activities comprising our culture look awfully foolish to modern men. On Ash Wednesday, your coworkers ask, "Why do you have dirt on your forehead?" Strangers in the restaurant look askance as you pray with your family before you eat your meal. Modern men think that we are fools. If you're willing to look foolish for a cause, that does not mean that you're willing to die for it, but it is awfully hard to imagine a man who's willing to die for a cause when he's not willing to look a little foolish for it, is it not? A father must be willing to die for his children, but he must also be willing to make silly faces so that they can laugh. But we stopped doing foolish things. That's just another thing we pay Hollywood professionals for. Today, the common man in this country knows he has lost his freedom. But how did it happen? As men thought less and less about the causes of things, as they stopped gathering and wondering, completely discarding leisure, they came to rely on machines, professionals, experts, government bureaucrats, and other outside conveniences to handle various tasks that their ancestors would have handled for themselves. That is how freedom was lost. So what do we do now? That's the big question, isn't it? What do we do now? How do we reverse this troublesome trend? I bring no grand top-down political solution. I ask nothing of professional politicians, experts, or wise guys. Chesterton wrote, "I would rather be governed by the common ruck of men than by that troublesome literary class to which I belong." That's a great line. I would rather be governed by the common ruck of men than by that troublesome literary class to which I belong. That sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? William F. Buckley Jr. famously said, "I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 faculty members of Harvard University." Common man with common sense. I share that sentiment. We can leave the experts to their own devices because in our present crisis, they are not the solution to our problem, they are the problem. We need to once again do things for their own sake. Chesterton says we should do some things even if we do them badly, such as writing our own love letters. But the trend today is toward automation. Over the last several years, I have received in my email inbox automated holiday cards from coworkers and even some friends and family members. The automated holiday card is the hot new thing with young people. It's tolerant, it's cheap, it's inoffensive, it's efficient, it's impersonal. No more running around fussing over pens and paper and stationery, any of that stuff. Best of all, it only takes a few minutes, so you can get right back to work. Donald wishes you a happy new year. Click here to reply. I love those. We have computer programs to sign and send our Christmas cards. How long before we have computers writing our own love letters? If we cannot even sign our own Christmas cards and write our own love letters, how can we hope to govern ourselves? I propose that we write our own letters and sign our own cards during this Christmas season. Can we do that? Some of you might already do that, and that's wonderful. You don't have to do it on parchment with a quill, although that would be really cool. You can use a pen, and you can use paper. Then you can send it to your loved one, or you can hand deliver it. It matters not. If you don't have anybody to write to, you can write to me, and I'll write you back. And you see, I promise. And then you see, you and I will have done something beautifully useless. And that's how this starts. Because in our struggle for freedom, it is the useless things that are most useful. And I sincerely hope this talk has been useless.